room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
This is episode 22, Quantum of Solace.
Following the death of Vesper, Bond makes his next mission personal. The hunt for those who blackmailed his lover leads him to the ruthless businessman Dominic Green. Bond learns that Green is plotting to gain total control of a vital natural resource, and he must navigate a minefield of danger and treachery to foil the plan. Beautifully written. Summary of the film. Jay, what did you remember about this, though, before you rewatched it recently?
I think with these ones, Andy, you know, now the films are more recent, I would probably say we probably remember more of the films opposed to the older ones. So I remembered Strawberry Fields being covered in oil and that being kind of a throwback to Goldfinger. I also remember that there was a hotel in the desert, which I remember, I couldn't quite remember what it looked like, but I remember it being quite long and odd looking. Also, there was a scene involving the opera performance as well. And I remember this quite clearly, where Bond was listening into the conversation, and then I remembered where the villains got up and started moving away, and that's how he was identifying the villains as well. And this is the third time I've seen Quantum of Solace, so I don't think that's a high number really for Bond. I'll probably say it's one of the least amount of times I've seen a Bond film, but I'd probably put that down to it's quite a recent film, although obviously you're going to say later on when it came out. Maybe would you say that's a recent film? A film that's what, 15 years now? I don't know, I've only seen it 3 times.
15 years old, yeah. No, 3 times. I'm thinking I've maybe only seen it 3 or 4 myself. So that's not too bad, really. I'd have to say, yeah, my list of things I remembered is quite similar to yours, if not slightly shorter. So I remember the throwback to Goldfinger, as you pointed out, the kind of strawberry dyeing by oil. I also remember the opening scene being a car chase through kind of tunnels. I think it was a lakeside in Italy, and there was like tunnels along the lakeside, and there was a chase there. The scene at the opera, which we're going to talk about in more detail, I remember that. And a vague recollection of something to do with Vesper's boyfriend, which I believe comes at the end. We will discuss, but before I watched it, I vaguely remembered something, but I couldn't remember exactly what it was. So let's get into it. So the main villains, we've got the aforementioned Dominic Green, we have General Medrano, Elvis, not Presley, we have Craig Mitchell, and we have Mr. White. And just the 2 Bond girls, Camille Montez and Strawberry Fields.
Craig Mitchell sounds like a brother from EastEnders. You know, when he got introduced in the film and he said Craig Mitchell, I thought, oh, that's quite a random name in a Bond film.
It's a Cockney gangster, isn't it? Not a Bond villain.
Yeah. So, theme song is Another Way to Die by Jack White and Alicia Keys. The opening credits, we got a desert setting, which obviously fits in with the film, and they tend to obviously fit in with the film as well, these opening credits. We got a bullet flying over the sand dunes, we got Bond silhouettes, we have the usual models as well, and if I am not mistaken, I think last week's Casino Royale, was the models? I can't quite remember if there was models, or there wasn't as in your face as they usually are, so we've got the models here. And we also see them spinning around, and also we see the Bond silhouette falling on the screen as well. In terms of Bond count, so this is the James Bond kills only, we've got 16 in Quantum of Solace.
A respectable number. Talking about gadgets, there's not a lot to talk about. There was what do you call, I suppose, a modified mobile phone. It's very light on gadgets, which we'll talk a little bit later on about as to why that may be. There is no introduction of James Bond, which I'm a little bit surprised by. So we don't get to hear that line in this film, but we do see Bond drinking a martini. Several, I think, if memory serves me correctly. He certainly had a few by the time you see him drinking his 6th, I think it is, on the plane. And we do not have any hat wearing or hat throwing, though. So that kind of covers some of the main talking points that we collect each pod. Let's talk about what our favourite scenes were. Jay, why don't you kick us off?
My favourite scene in Quantum of Solace, I think, was an easy one, Andy. And it's the opera scene. I don't know if you call it opera house because obviously it's outdoors, but it's the opera setting. And it's the bit where Bond is listening in to the conversation between the different villains. So I liked that bit. So he's opposite and he scales the ladders, the scaffolding bit. And the villains are talking, but obviously he's taking that earpiece a little bit earlier on. And he's listening. And I like how he then interrupts the conversation. And they kind of start panicking, thinking, oh no, have we been, caught out here? So then they start getting up. But Mr. White obviously then doesn't. He just takes his earpiece out and he just plays it straight. So I thought that was quite good. So not much action happening in that bit. I liked the bit afterwards, with the chase and everything. I thought that was really good. But I quite enjoyed that bit, the surveillance bit. So it's probably not as exciting as some of the other scenes that we've picked out in previous films, Andy. But I quite enjoyed that one. It was something different, I think. What about you, Andy? What was your favourite scene?
So I'd put that one probably as my second favourite. Like you said, it was more of a dramatic setting, and I think the whole way it played out with the villains communicating with each other whilst in plain sight, I thought it was really, really cleverly done. But I just picked another scene over the top of it, and that's just after the opening credits. There is the reveal that Craig Mitchell is actually a villain. He starts shooting and then he legs it, and Bond chases after him. So there's a foot race kind of through the tunnels and then over the rooftops, and all the while this is going on, there's the horse race in the is it Siena in Italy? I think it is. There's kind of a horse race, which I'm assuming is a famous horse race. I'm not too familiar with it, but it was a very memorable scene. And then it turns, there's this foot chase going on at the same time, and then they join into the horse race. There's shooting, there's mayhem. It's just really well done, and then it culminates in a fight scene between the two. Just the whole sequence I thought was really, really cleverly done, packed full of action. And so yeah, that one edged it for me. So another question we ask each week, Jay, how many times did you reach for your phone while watching this?
So Andy, I was naughty in this episode, so I think I've had quite a few episodes now where I've had 0 times reaching for the phone. This time it was 3. And I remember writing a note, and I remember thinking I will explain to Andy why it was those 3. Now, obviously, it's a few days after we've written the notes, and I completely forgot what they were. I can't remember if football was on and I was checking the score, or my daughter has TikTok on her phone now and she keeps constantly sending TikTok videos about food, or something else. But I know it wasn't Bond related. It was totally not Bond related. But it was 3 times and it was spread out through the film. So it was look at the phone. So I did something, but it wasn't for long. It was only for like a minute tops. But yeah, it was. I struggled a bit, Andy, with this one, if I'm honest. So yeah, I did get distracted. How about you? Were you disciplined?
I was disciplined, yeah. I went for the phone precisely 0 times. What I will say, though, just going back to your point around your reasons for reaching for your phone, it did sound like you were setting up a quiz question there. Like, which one of these statements may be true in terms of, here are the possible reasons why I reached for my phone. But no, I stuck with it, watched it through uninterrupted, and maybe I enjoyed it more for that. I guess there's one way to find out, and that's to talk about the all-important rating. Jay, do you want to start? What was your rating out of 10 for Quantum of Solace?
I gave Quantum of Solace a respectable 6. So obviously we'll talk about rankings later on in terms of where that drops out of the 22 films that we've watched so far. So I think 6 is fair. So what about you, Andy?
A slightly more generous 7. I would say I enjoyed it more than I remembered first time round. I had in my mind that this was the Craig film to forget, but actually I was pleasantly surprised. So 7 out of 10 I think is a good score for me. So we've had your opinion, we've had mine. What about your wife? What was her opinion of this film?
So when she wasn't on her phone, so she was on her phone quite a bit, she stayed awake for this film, but I think her points are very valid, Andy. So I don't know what you thought when you saw these notes. So she felt it was like a sequel to Type Loose Ends from Casino Royale, and we're going to mention this obviously in a bit, that it takes place, doesn't it, pretty much straight away after Casino Royale. So you can see why. I think, Andy, is this the one one of the few times it is a sequel. I think back to maybe On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Diamonds Are Forever are kind of like one film ends and Connery in Diamonds Are Forever is, you know, after Blofeld because of Tracy dying. I don't know if you class that, you know, in terms of like it continuing over 2 films. But apart from that, you know, what I just mentioned, I can't think of any other instances where it's directly pretty much a continuation of the previous film.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would go as far as say that doesn't count as a sequel because it didn't necessarily continue the story, although it does refer to elements from previous films. So the way I view it, and you know, feel free to jump in and correct me, and listeners out there, feel free to correct me if you think otherwise. I feel like films 1 to 20 were a continuation of the timeline, but not necessarily a continuation of the story. I think they are 20 separate stories running one after the other, whereas I think for Casino Royale, then Quantum of Solace, it is a continuation of the story. That's how I would differentiate. But I'm happy to be proven wrong if people think otherwise.
No, I think that's fair enough from my point of view, Andy. But we've obviously got some Bond super fans out there. Maybe they would disagree. But carrying on with the wife's verdict, so she mentioned that. She also said there was very little substance to the film. And she said if it was a book, it would be more like a novella. And I don't know what you think of this, Andy, but I made a note of this as well. So she said, we're singing from the same hymn sheet here. She said there were too many chases, and she pointed out that we had car chases, planes, boats, and at least one foot chase. So I don't know what your thoughts on that is. Considering the length of the film that we're going to talk about in a minute, there seem to be a lot of chases.
Hard to argue that, I would say. I don't know can you have too many? I guess you can. Let's briefly thinking back to previous films. Would we say there was one chase per film? Or certainly one memorable one. Whereas, like you said, there's probably at least 3 or 4 in this. So, yeah, I'd say that's a valid point.
Yeah, I think, you 1 or 2, like you said, probably one main centerpiece in terms of like a big boat chase or a big ski chase. And then there might be one smaller one. But this one, it just felt like chase, 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 chase. So in terms of bringing the story along, in terms of like the narrative and the plot, it didn't seem like there was much to it. And like the missus said, little substance. So a lot of action, but not much substance behind it. That was obviously her fault, and obviously me and you gave it 6 and 7 respectively out of 10. And TikTok viewers out there have obviously voiced their disagreement, Andy, with some of our ratings as well. So obviously it's very subjective.
It is indeed. We are not the official Bond raters, although if you're looking for the leading source of Bond film rating podcasts, I'd say we're probably in the top 1. So forget the others out there. I joke, of course. But no, it's good to get that level of engagement, and it's good to get different opinions. My wife, just for reference, is still not watching Bond films yet. I did mention in previous episodes I'm going to try and get her to watch the last one. I'm probably going to try and twist her arm for Skyfall as well, because I just think she'll enjoy it, whether she knows it or not yet. I don't know. I just think that's the one for her. She did watch, and I believe I mentioned this prior, she did watch Casino Royale with me a long time ago, sort of, in that she kept falling asleep and was a bit disinterested, and so she remembers some elements of it. But my thinking was, if she's going to miss one of the Craig films, this will be the one to miss. But to be confirmed. Let's see what happens in the coming weeks, but I will do my best to get her involved with Skyfall for next week's episode. Let's take a few more facts before we move on. So the runtime was 1 hour 46, and that's massively down from last week. Certainly seems short. I've got a feeling I know where it's going to come in the rankings. We'll talk later on, but seems against the grain in terms of what we've had in recent weeks. So a very short Bond film, released in 2008, and was directed by Mark Forster.
And now, our usual usual listeners will, recognise what we usually talk about here. And we're talking about some general points before we kind of get into the film and various other elements that we like to talk about. But I always like to kick off with the budget and the box office stats. So let's look at the budget. So the budget for Quantum of Solace was 230 million, and that is surprisingly a franchise high so far, and it's a massive increase of 128 million on Casino Royale. So Casino Royale only came out 2 years earlier, but they've added 128 million dollars on that budget, which seems very significant. I think in terms of our scores, and obviously we're going to look at the rankings later on, but our listeners will remember that me and Andy both scored Casino Royale quite high. So when you think about it, it's put an extra 128 million in the budget, but I think the quality has dropped quite a lot compared to Casino Royale. In terms of box office stats, at the time it was 591.7 million worldwide, and that means when you adjust it to today's money, it's about 795.3 million, which is a drop of $55 million compared to Casino Royale. So they're putting 128 million. But they've actually took 55 million less, which isn't, I'm not a business or dealing with finance on a day-to-day, Andy, but even, from my limited experience of investments and return, that is not good business, Andy.
Hard to argue that. I mean, clearly they've made a profit. That's good news. But real terms, they've not really made much more. And like you said, that's a huge increase in budget. So the return on investment proportionally is obviously much lower, and I wonder if this extra 128 million is to account for all the chase scenes and all the mayhem that they tend to cause. So that might explain some of that. A couple more points just to add to that. There's no Q branch again, and indeed no Q. So this is 2 films in a row. Craig's Bond doesn't visit Q, doesn't use any Q's gadgets. Does Q branch even exist at this point? I don't know if it's even mentioned. So really surprising, and one of the key elements of Bond missing. And up to Quantum of Solace, so up to this point, it's the only Bond film since GoldenEye not to have a title sequence by Daniel Kleinman, and only the third not to have a title sequence designed by either Kleinman or Morris Binder. The others being From Russia with Love and Goldfinger from back in the 60s.
And another kind of unique point really for Quantum of Solace is up until this point in the franchise, this is the only film that does not feature a romance between Bond and the main Bond girl. I think they might share a kiss, but there's no kind of boogieing around, so that's quite unique as well.
I think a kiss is as far as it goes, you're right.
Yeah. Sounds familiar, I'm afraid. But anyway, moving on, because my wife listens to this podcast, so I best not, mention any more about bedroom activities or lack of, but let's carry on moving. So the new director to the Bond franchise, Foster, has previously directed Monsters Ball, Finding Neverland, and he's also directed World War Z and Christopher Robin. And out of those 4 films, Andy, I've seen all 4, and I really liked Finding Neverland and World War Z. Christopher Robin was not bad, and obviously Monsters Ball with the Bond link with Jinx and Halle Berry winning an Oscar for that, if I'm not mistaken. A little nod there, relationship. Have you seen any of those films, Andy? Or
I've seen three of the 4. Yeah, I've seen Monsters Ball, Finding Neverland, World War Z. We should probably call it World War Z, shouldn't we? being in the UK, but it was called World War Z. I don't want to offend anyone with Z in their name, like a Jay-Z, for example. But no, Christopher Robin is the one I've not seen, which is surprising because I'm sure it's of that list, it would be the one my wife would want to see the most. So I've missed a trick there, haven't I?
Yeah, and World War Z or Z, I think was a really good film. I enjoyed that, and when we were writing up these notes, I did a bit of googling this because I always remember that there was supposed to be a sequel to that, but it always never kind of happened. And as doing the research for this, I found an article to basically say, yeah, they knocked it on the head. They were trying to do it, but then things kept coming up, and then they knocked it on the head. So yeah, it never happened, unfortunately.
Yeah, see, the problem there was starting at the end of the alphabet, because where do you go from there? If it was World War A, it could have been 25 sequels. But he's made a bit of a goof there, hasn't he? And speaking of goofs, nice transition, see what I did there? Let's talk about some of the goofs and continuity errors of Quantum of Solace.
The Reading Room.
So the first one, when Bond follows Camille to Crean's place on the docks, you can see there's a road sweeper in the background, sweeping fresh air. I didn't pick that one up, actually, so that's a good spot from you there, Jay. The second one, this is one I did pick up, and I had to kind of question it in my own mind, but I'm pretty sure I'm right here. So at the end of Casino Royale, Bond is, the very last scene, he's wearing a three-piece suit when he takes Mr. White. Quantum of Solace, which begins basically minutes later, it's directly following on from Casino Royale, Bond is wearing a completely different suit. So at what point did he think it was necessary to wear a completely different suit? Another note, which is a little bit later on, but I'll mention it now just because it ties in nicely. Daniel Craig has much longer hair. So they've clearly not taken note of his hairstyle from Casino Royale, because his hair is noticeably longer. And if you're going to go for continuity, you've got to cut the hair so it's the same. But for me, it was it was egregious.
I agree, Andy, and I'm losing my hair by the minute, whereas Daniel Craig is growing his by minutes. But I always think, and I'm going off topic slightly here, Andy, where TV programs where you might have a season with 20, 13 episodes, and the season ends with a cliffhanger, but then season 2 starts within the same scene, and you think, oh, I wonder if they just recorded it all at the same time. So, make sure, like you're saying, about haircuts are the same, people's weights the same, or do they basically, oh yeah, we've got another season, let's, try to reenact this bit so it's seamless. I always wonder what they do with those.
I guess it would depend on whether you're going to have a sequel or a following season. Because I guess you could have the danger of filming the scenes that follow on and then being cancelled and never get to show them, so you've wasted your money. Or on the flip side, you leave it, find out you've got an extra season, and then you've got to add to the budget with stylists and tailors and personal trainers and such to get them back into previous shape. I'd imagine that's how it works anyway.
And Andy, going back to the continuity error where you said about the road sweeper, I knew about this before I watched the film. So as it was happening, I said, wife, obviously I called her by her name. I said, wife, look in the back at this bit. There's a road sweeper sweeping fresh air. And I saw it, but the wife, I don't know if she was looking or she was on the phone, but I had to wind it back, and then it happened. And she was like, how does that even happen? I said, I don't know. I said, I don't know why as a road sweeper, even if they're thinking about sound, while they're recording the dialogue, surely sweeping wouldn't make much noise. Anyway, after watching the film and then writing the notes up, Andy, that is happening of at least one other film, because I found it on Twitter of someone showing the James Bond one, but in another film there's someone, I don't know if it's road sweeping, I remember seeing pretending to eat. So they basically had the food on the fork still, bring it to the mouth, and then take it away with the food on the fork still, in the background. But yeah, I thought that was, I thought it was funny.
The Reading Room.
Moving on, so we've got the opening scene, and this is a bit before all the music. So this is usually when we talk about the gun barrel, but the gun barrel sequence isn't actually in the usual place, it's actually at the end. So we're going to move over this bit now and pick that up later on. So the opening scene is, as Andy mentioned, continuing on from Casino Royale. So we're in Italy still. And when this first scene happened, Andy, I don't know what you thought of my note here, and I can't remember which Jurassic Park film it is. There's a Jurassic Park film where the camera kind of comes in from the ocean and you kind of see like the island and it all looks honky-dory. There's a family playing on the beach, and the kid starts walking off to more of the jungle bit, and then the little dinosaurs are there. When that shot was happening, because it comes in slowly and you can kind of see the island, or you can see the land, I thought that reminds me of Jurassic Park, but obviously it's not, because then you got car chase and everything.
I didn't think that at the time, but when I saw your note, it was like, yeah, he's making a good point there. I don't want to be too simplistic, but it was very cinematic, wasn't it? Which I guess is the whole point of a film. But I hope you know what I mean by that. That it was very much. It's one of those scenes that works in the cinema. You wouldn't shoot something like that for TV, in my opinion.
No, and it was. I thought it was quite good because it was very slow, and then it obviously started going into where the actually car chase was happening. So I think it was well directed, this film.
Yeah, I agree. We're straight into the action. We're in the midst of a car chase. Obviously, we're picking up straight from where Casino Royale left off, as mentioned. Bond is being chased by some goons. It's a very short scene. There's, a lot that goes on, a lot of crashes. There's guns being fired. Bond's Aston Martin is an absolute mess by the time he pulls up in Siena because of the nature of the scene. I think he's missing a door. There's scratches and wind. It's a real mess. And then he finally gets away. He pulls into the city or village of Siena, opens the boot, and then we see that Mr. White is in the boot. So he's kidnapped him, put him in the boot, and taken him away. And that's the end of the opening scene. And I thought it was very, very short. I didn't time it, but I bet it was less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, and did you remember that this film continued straight afterwards? Because it was only when he opened the boot to see Mr. White, then I thought, oh yeah, it's directly afterwards.
I didn't remember that it was directly afterwards, as in, same day, same hour, or whatever it's supposed to be. I knew there was a continuation, but yeah, it was at that point where he's in the boot that I'm thinking, oh, he's obviously got him from when we saw him last. Because otherwise, he's gone to see him, he shot him in the leg, then he's left him for a bit and then gone back however many weeks or days later, which wouldn't make sense. But it would give him time to grow his hair.
True. So now we're in the opening title sequence with the music. So this is the first duet for a Bond theme song. So as mentioned earlier, it's performed by Jack White and Alicia Keys. So Jack White also wrote the song. And David Arnold returns to the franchise for the last time. So Arnold has composed 5 films in total. 5 Bond films, should I say, in total. And Jack White, so he's best known for being the lead singer and guitarist of the White Stripes. And White has won numerous awards, including 12 Grammys. So Andy, I need to make a confession here. As part of the research of, doing it for this episode, I've obviously heard of Jack White and the White Stripes. However, I didn't realise that the person in the White Stripes with him, which I think is Meg White, was his wife. I always thought they were brother and sister. And then the sister didn't want the limelight, so he went on his own. So it was only when I was Googling it and doing the research, and I said, oh, it said he's married to Meg White, and now he's married to someone else. Oh, I think he might even be divorced again. And yes, I never knew that. So
I feel like I'm finding out this information right now, live on air, because when you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, he's gonna say, oh, I've just found out that they're brother and sister, because that's exactly what I thought as well. So I am in shock. If this was a video podcast, there would just be me open mouth, stunned, and there were. I honestly thought they were brother and sister as well. So there you go. Every day is a school day.
Yeah, unless he married his sister. But
I don't know if that's legal in all states of America, but if there are any rednecks out there who have married their sister, please feel free to contact us, and congratulations on your nuptials to your sibling. Probably offended God knows how many Christians or whatever with that. We'll cut that out. So he didn't duet with his wife/sister. He duetted with Alicia Keys, like you mentioned. Alicia herself has sold over 90 million records worldwide, won 15 Grammy Awards. It's not competition, but it's 15-12 for those keeping count. Interesting little bit of information, and I think I knew this in the back of my mind. I knew there was a connection with Amy Winehouse, but Amy Winehouse and Mark Ronson actually recorded a demo song for the film, but nothing came of it due to Winehouse's legal issues. I think there was a documentary recently we watched about the music of Bond, and I remember the talk of Barbara Broccoli meeting Winehouse, and it sounded quite sad. I thought the way that she seemed very distracted. She was apparently interested, taking loads of notes, and then she left the notebook, and Barbara Broccoli opened the notebook, and she'd just been writing the word Blake over and over again, not actually writing notes. That was a kind of a standout to me. So that's kind of one of those what could have been moments there. Let's get back into the film proper. So once the title sequence is over, we're back in Italy. We're about an hour after the conclusion of Casino Royale, as mentioned, and Bond is in his suit and he's got his long hair. Longer hair, not long hair. Mr. White is about to be interrogated. We see M talking to Bond about Vesper and what happened at Casino Royale. Bond comes across as kind of cold, distant, hiding his feelings, you might say. Would you agree with that, Jay?
I agree with that, Andy. That's a good observation. Bond, yeah, the whole Daniel Craig interpretation of Bond. Yeah, I don't know. We can pick that up another time. But yeah, it's obviously that it's obvious that he's still hurting from Vesper. But then if this is set an hour later, it's obviously fresh, and it's not, 2 years difference in time in terms of film release. So you can, it is still very much raw. So you can understand that. So M threatens Mr. White, we've told you, and Mr. White is laughing, and he starts to taunt M. He says something along the lines of, our organisation has been worrying, we're thinking the intelligence agencies are closing in on them. And he then, he's having a bit of I think he's chuckling, isn't he? And he's saying, basically, you guys haven't got a clue who we are, kind of thing.
Yeah, he's he feels like he's in control. I think at one point he even laughs, "You don't even know we exist." So there's clearly something going on that M and Bond and the gang are clueless to. Yeah,
definitely. And then he even says something like, "We've got people everywhere," and then he kind of looks at Grant and Phil's brother Craig, and Craig Mitchell then jumps into action, and it turns out he's obviously a double agent. And then we see M make a quick escape here as well, Andy.
We do, and I have a question, and we talked about this briefly before we started recording, but I'm going to mention it again, even if it does make me sound like an idiot. Does she get shot? Because I thought she got shot and was retreating wounded, but then I don't think it's ever mentioned or even referenced, so she can't have been, but I thought she was. Tell me what's going on here, Jay. Am I going crazy?
I don't think you're going crazy, Andy. I think when there's that bit where Mitchell tries to shoot and she's kind of I don't know if she's ducking or hobbling, but she's kind of near the wall and trying to make her escape. So you could say she's kind of bent over because she's got shot or wounded. But obviously, in a few minutes we're going to talk about the next scene. There's no sign of injury or anything, is there? And no mention of that, like you said. So I think it's probably just a near miss, and she's just looking after number one there. She's just trying to escape, whereas obviously it prompts Bond into action, and we get this chase that you like. My note here is we are treated to a good chase. So, Andy, this is the one that you've enjoyed, isn't it, with the actual chase?
It is indeed, yeah.
So a lot of your favourite scenes, Andy, my voice went quite high pitched then. So a lot of your favourite scenes from memory are always not all the time, but seem to be quite early on in films.
Yeah, I like to peak early and then peter out as time goes on. Story of my life.
So, as Andy mentioned earlier, this involves Mitchell escaping, Bond is chasing him through the cave system. Then, as Andy mentioned earlier, you got the running across the horse track. There's the chase on top of the buildings. Then Bond and Mitchell fall through some kind of glass ceiling, and then there's some scaffolding as well. And then eventually Bond ends up killing Mitchell. And then when Bond returns, we can see that Mr. White has escaped, so he's out there somewhere.
Yeah, it's a nice scene, that is. I think it's a good way. That would have been a good opening scene as a cold open, but I think it was a good second scene, the music. But from Italy, we're back to London. Bond and M are in Mitchell's apartment. There's like a CSI type crew there, aren't they? Just dusting for prints and going through everything. And there doesn't seem to be any leads. M's flustered. She said Mitchell passed all the regular security checks. I think she said she'd been a bodyguard for so many years, and clearly nothing would suggest that he is the double agent that he clearly is. And we see This is back in MI6. We see some operatives. They're using kind of snazzy IT equipment, and it's kind of like a touchscreen table type thing, isn't it? Where they're going through some marked bills, some marked notes, and they say, "Oh, we found this marked note," and then make some comment, "Well, you probably find one in my purse because they're that all over the place." But then it leads them down this path to a lead in Haiti, but on the back of these marked notes, and that's where we're off next. And Jay, you can pick it up from there.
So now we're in Haiti, and Bond follows up the lead now, and he has a fight with Edmund Slate in a hotel room, and my note here was Slate is no match for Bond, and Bond dispatches Slate with ease and quickness.
That's very succinctly put. I'll give you my exact notes because I think the time it took me to write this is probably the same amount of time as the scene lasted. So this is it word for word what I wrote. Bond goes to find Slate. Bond finds Slate. Bond fights Slate. Bond kills Slate. And that is the scene. It's a nice little fight scene. Don't get me wrong. It's pretty brutal, but it's over before it begins. Really. From there, Bond leaves the hotel. He's picked up by a beautiful lady in a car. I think she just pulls up next to him and says, "Get in," and he does. And he makes some remark during this journey that Bond, he doesn't have any friends. I can't remember exact words, but he makes some remark that he doesn't have any friends.
He does. I can't remember which one of the two notices that they've got someone following, but she says, "One of your friends," or "He's one of your friends," and that's when he says he doesn't have any friends. So, as I just mentioned, they're being followed, and it comes to light that Slate was actually hired to kill Camille. And then obviously, he opens a suitcase and sees the photo and the gun, and Camille tries to kill Bond as well, thinking that he's obviously Slate because he's obviously taken his place. But Bond manages to escape. And then the goon on the motorbike comes up, and Bond basically just knocks kind of like he knocks the bike so the bike goes flying, or did he just knock the rider?
I don't. Does he like kick his leg from under him or something that makes the bike spin? Yeah, it's it looks like an elaborate soccer tackle for our American listeners, or football tackle as we would call it in normal English.
We then see we're introduced to the main villain of Quantum of Solace, and Dominic Green, as Andy mentioned at the top of the pod. And Green is played by French actor and director Matthew Amalric. And he's appeared in numerous French films, and I've only seen a handful of French films before, and he's not in any of those. But interestingly, he's actually worked with Spielberg and Wes Anderson as well.
Quite the resume. I don't know if there's a French word for resume, but it's quite the CV he's got anyway. Bond is keeping an eye on him. He's kind of surveilling the scene, and he goes up to one of the guards and he leaves his business card, and we see the business card is for Universal Exports, which made me smile because we've seen Universal Exports in many films, but this is the first time in the Craig era that we see him using that Universal Exports cover. Whilst we're here, it's kind of at the docks, isn't it? Camille is taken by General Medrano. Green finds out that Camille's been snooping around. Bond sets off after the General and uses the bike to kind of cross over some boats before transferring to the boat and crashing the boat into the General's boat. That sounded very convoluted. It's a pretty cool scene. Much better watching it than listening to me describe it, that's for sure. But he uses this elaborate way of getting onto a boat to crash into the General's boat, and then he saves Camille and escapes.
Yeah, and we've got this boat chase here, and this very much reminded me of the Roger Moore era of boat chases, because Roger Moore had boat chases and obviously he had ski chases, but he was the one Bond that I would have said that was, you think of boat chases, you would have said Roger Moore. So Daniel Craig's getting into the action as well. So it turns out that Camille had actually deliberately got herself into that position so she can go to kill the General. Now we're on the airplane. So Bond is talking to M and Tanner about Green. M then makes a call to the Americans to say they've got no interest in Green, which is a lie, and M explains why. That is to Tanner, which I thought, that's a bit of a drop ball there for Tanner. Surely she would have, cotton on why there is an interest from the Americans on that. And the Americans are talking to Green and they're working with each other. So we get Greg Beam here, and he's the CIA section chief for the South America region. And Beam, when I saw this, Andy, I thought, yes, Beam is played by David Harper. And Harper is obviously featured in numerous roles across, various TV and film. He's been in Stranger Things, is how I know him, obviously on Netflix. He's appeared in Black Widow, which I've not seen, is on my watch list, Andy, but he's appeared in Suicide Squad. And also another film I've not seen is he's played Santa Claus, Andy, but it's in a film called Violent Night, so it doesn't sound very Christmassy.
Yeah, probably not one for the kids before Santa visits them in the morning, that's for sure. I've seen Suicide Squad. I don't remember him in that, so clearly I didn't enjoy it as much. But Stranger Things, absolutely love, fantastic, and he's really, really good in that. So I too I didn't remember that he was in this, so it was a pleasant surprise to see him on screen.
Andy, I didn't realise that when I was looking at his Wikipedia IMDb page, I didn't realise he was been in so many things before Stranger Things. I think Stranger Things, I wouldn't necessarily say it made him, but I think it's the role that's kind of sparked all these other roles that he's getting.
It's the one that stands head and shoulders above all others, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's going to open all kinds of doors.
And in Suicide Squad, Andy, I don't know what the character's name is, but do you remember the scene where the lady, I can't think what her name is, the lady that basically wants to pull together the Suicide Squad, and she's doing that presentation, and you got like a bunch of suits on the side of the table, and she's doing that presentation. He's one of those suits.
Okay. So he's almost background fodder, isn't he? To an extent. Yeah. But now, Stranger Things. And I've, just on a personal note, from him, he's married to Lily Allen, isn't he?
He is, yeah. I didn't know they were married. I know that they met on a dating app.
Yeah, there you go.
Not Tinder.
I was gonna say something really crude when you said he's been in lots of other things. I was gonna say, yeah, he's been in Lily Allen as well. I don't know if we'll cut that out or not. I quite like it, but we'll see when it gets to editing. Anyway, let's get back on track. Beam says he will get rid of Bond for Green, and just before this happens, there's a photo of Bond, and he shows it to Felix. And like, do you know who this is? And Felix denies who it is, and Beam just says, "Oh no, that's James Bond, isn't it? He's a secret agent." And you get that kind of, there's a bit of a tension between them, and my question here was, is Beam trying to make Felix look bad, or is it just the nature of his character or his role? I don't know, but it felt like they were not fully on the same page at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think Beam is suspicious. Maybe by passing the photo of Bond to Felix, with Beam knowing it's actually Bond, was to kind of test his loyalty, to say, actually, are you in with us or are you not? And did you know, Andy, that Felix Leiter was supposed to have had more scenes in this film, but they were cut?
I did not know that. That's a good bit of research you've done there. I like this. I like this version of Leiter. I think Jeffrey Wright's an excellent actor. We're moving away from the plane now. We're off to the opera. So this is the scene you mentioned as your favourite. He's tracking Green. Bond is. He's noticed that there's like goodie bags being given out with various things in, and he takes care of someone who has that, and within the goodie bag is an earpiece. So Bond takes the earpiece. I think it's quite an amusing scene where I think he beats him up in the toilet or something, doesn't he? Or the impression is that he's beating him up in the toilet, and then he shuts the door and breaks the handle off. And then he's listening into the conversation. So as you mentioned earlier, he climbs up the scaffolding so he's kind of behind the stage, isn't he? High up behind the stage, and he's looking at the crowd with the earpiece in, and then the conversation starts happening where the villains are talking about their plans, and Bond interrupts at some point. I can't remember exactly what he says, but something like, you should maybe not meet in such a public place. So obviously everyone knows they've been rumbled, so the aforementioned villains all start standing up and leaving their seats, and at that point Bond's looking at them. He can see who's leaving their seats, and he starts taking photos on his phone when they're leaving. So quite cleverly done by Bond, but like I said earlier, quite a well played dramatic scene, I thought.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the modified phone, Andy, from the gadget that you mentioned earlier. This is where he's obviously taking photos. And Tanner, isn't it? Ease up, because I think, is it Em about to get in a bath at this stage? But Tanner's working late.
Yep,
and
Bond
is sending the photos, and obviously Tanner's running them through the system. So this is what I said earlier about this is my favourite scene. But I also like the bit afterwards, and I like it where Bond obviously then starts walking into the building, and he's in the corridor, isn't he? And Dominic Green and his goons kind of like then come on the other side, and they kind of just look at each other. Dominic Green does this nod to one of his henchmen. Bond then just starts walking down the corridor, and then you see him run. But it's punctured with scenes from the opera as well, and the sound from the opera seems to be amplified compared to the gunshots and Bond chasing. So I love how it was keep cutting between the opera scenes, which was very dramatic because there was a murder scene in that bit, then Bond being chased. So I thought that was really good. So that obviously, I mentioned this is my favourite scene, but that bit afterwards was really, really good as well.
Yeah, excellent. I really liked how it's fun. You almost talking me into changing my favourite scene, to be honest. But yeah, it was really, really well done.
And then it just carries on. So then Bond lets one of the goons fall off the top. This reminded me of Sandor from The Spy Who Loved Me, isn't it? Do you remember where he's hanging on by the tie? Roger Moore just,
Yeah.
It just does it. That brought back memories of good old Roger Moore. And it turns out he's actually the bodyguard of Guy Haynes, who we find out is an advisor to the British PM. But the bodyguard survives the fall, and it's Green. Green says to one of his henchmen, "Is he one of us?" or something like that. And the henchman says no. And he says, like, "Why is he looking at me?" Or "He shouldn't be looking at me." And then the henchman goes out and just basically shoots him once or twice in the head. But obviously Bond is then framed for this. And then M finds out, and she revokes all of Bond's credentials as well. So because they believe Bond has killed the bodyguard.
Yeah, nice scene there. And he goes to the airport, doesn't he? Tries to get a ticket. Everything's been declined. And he says to the woman behind the desk, "You're going to get a call in a minute. Can you tell him I've gone to Cairo?" And she agrees, because I guess she's taken by Bond and his new long-haired look. But he doesn't go to Cairo. He's off to Italy. And he meets up with Mathis. They have a bit of a chit-chat. And he says, basically, "Why don't you come with me?" And Mathis agrees to go to Bolivia with Bond to investigate further.
Andy, I got one question here. And I didn't write this down in the notes, but I did pose this question to the wife. He says something, doesn't he? He says something like, "I'd rather go to Bolivia than put suntan on her once more," or along to those lines, doesn't he? He says something about that. I said to my wife something like, "I'd rather put suntan on the woman." I know. I mean, it's nice, sunny villa, enjoying the weather, and I'm going to be putting suntan lotion on this beautiful woman, or I go to a South American country where I might end up dead.
Yeah, it's not really it's not really a hard choice, is it? I would say. I did like the dynamic between Mathis and was her name Gemma? I think it was the lady he was with, and she mentioned something about the wine, and he says, "Well, I can't remember what it says, but she basically has a go at him for only buying cheap wine." So it was a nice scene, but maybe he's had enough of her nagging and complaining about the cheap wine. That's why he wants a bit of peace and quiet over in Bolivia. But over in Bolivia, Bond and Mathis are greeted at the airport by someone who introduces herself as Fields. Just Fields, I believe, when she's questioned further. She tells Bond, go back to England, basically. Now, Fields, Strawberry Fields, to give her a full name, is played by British actress Gemma Arterton. She's since featured in various roles in TV and film, including The King's Man, Rogue Agent, and The Escape, amongst others. And she basically tells him to go back to England, and Bond asks when's the next flight, and she says it's tomorrow, so okay, they can go to a hotel then. So off to the hotel they go, but Bond, he's not happy with the hotel she's chosen, so they change hotels, and they're off to a fancier hotel. And I think they make some comment about being teachers on sabbatical, and she says, well, that's not going to work for our cover when we go to this fancy hotel. So he goes to the fancy hotel and says, we're cheated on tobacco and we've won the lottery. It took me back to the Casino Royale scene where he's got a hotel room under an assumed name, but just tells them that his name's Bond. It's just that kind of that arrogance, that devil may care attitude. I quite liked it. It's a good scene. But at the hotel, it's not long before Bond has seduced Fields. He's back to his old ways, and she just goes along with it, just like Bond girls did back in the old days.
And he uses such it's not even a cheesy chat-up line. He basically says something along the lines of something about stationery, doesn't he?
Yeah, he says, he's in the bedroom, isn't he? He's like, oh, can you come and help me look for the stationery? Or something ridiculous like that, isn't it?
Yeah, I said to the wife, oh yeah, that would work, wouldn't it? But I suppose for Bond, it obviously does. So Arterton won an Empire Award for Best Newcomer for her role as Strawberry Fields. And Andy, I don't know if you picked up on this, but Strawberry Fields her first name isn't actually mentioned in the film, is it?
I don't think it is. I knew her name was Strawberry Fields, but she only ever introduced herself as Fields, doesn't she?
Yeah, so you only see her first name in the credits as Strawberry Fields.
Obviously, a Beatles fan must have named her. We see James and Strawberry. See that when you if I call them Bond and Fields, that sounds good, but let's call them James and Strawberry. Yeah, James and Strawberry and Camille and Green. They're at a fundraiser later on. My question here, and again, this may be something I've either misremembered or I'm just thinking it in the wrong way, but why is Camille even there, or how did she get there? Because if you think of it from Dominic's perspective, he must have invited her because it's a guest list type thing. Because there's a scene in the hotel where Mathis gives Bond the invite, says you've been invited to a party. So Camille must have been invited, and this is after he's tried to kill her and after she's tried to kill the general and all the other stuff that's been going on. So I just found it very strange that she would even be there in the first place.
I agree. Unless she had an invite before it all kicked off and they were just very poor in terms of housekeeping and hadn't updated the list. She's there, isn't she, just to keep that connection, to try to get back to the general? Because she doesn't have an in, does she, with the general, unless it's via Dominic Green?
I think that's it, yeah. And the way she's acting is she's acting like she's still his girlfriend, even though she's pissed off at him. So it's weird.
She antagonizes him, doesn't? Because he's doing some spiel about something that his company's done, and then she comes in and said, oh yeah, you made billions or millions from that, didn't you, by doing X, Y, Z? And then he kind of ushers her away.
Yeah, she's made him look stupid in front of some very important people.
Yeah, and then I think it's pretty much straight away actually with this bit. Green and Camille go to I don't know if you call it a balcony. There's a up the stairs, and there's a bit overlooking, and Camille kind of cottons on that, oh, are you gonna like knock me over the wall? But he does kind of push, and the wall kind of gives in a little bit, but obviously doesn't fall, and she looks a bit startled there. But then Bond comes to the rescue, and there's a little chit chat here between Green and Bond. And I know we do the quotes and one-liners later, but I think this is a good opportunity to kind of capture this one. And this involves a little sassy exchange, and Green goes, my friends call me Dominic. And then Bond says, I'm sure they do. And I thought that was good, because he's just not messing around. He's like, yeah, whatever kind of thing. He's just not scared as well at all. And then Bond and Camille goes, and then Elvis is coming down the stairs, and Fields just kind of trips him, and as he falls to the bottom, his hairpiece comes up a bit, doesn't he? Doesn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And
he's a bit of a clown, isn't he, in this? So.
Yeah, he is, yeah. And Bond and Camille leave, and then shortly are stopped by the police. And then this is where we see Mathis has actually been dumped in the boot, and then he's been shot at by the police. So I had a question here. Did Bond use Mathis as a human shield here? Because he got beaten up and dumped, but I don't believe he's been stabbed or shot beforehand. I think it might have just been a beating, but he's near death. And then as he's getting him out, it seems like Bond, because I think one of the policemen say he's alive or something like that, and then Bond kind of seems to use him as a human shield.
I think he does. I don't know how intentional it is. I mean, I don't know how you can accidentally use someone as a human shield, but do you know what I mean? Just the kind of how he lifts him out of the boot is kind of, he falls that way. He doesn't have to like spin round a 180 or anything. I don't think it's that extreme. But yeah, he clearly does use him as a human shield, doesn't he?
Yeah, this reminded me, and you might remember the film better than me, the scene where Bond is dancing with one of the villain's woman, and they're dancing, and then one of the goons goes to shoot Bond, but the body's placed in between, and then he covers up the bullet hole, and then he says some kind of one-liner to say, you know, when he puts her down, like she's dead on her feet or something like that. Do you remember that bit? I can't remember which film that is.
I can't remember which film. I'm pretty sure it's Connery, though, isn't it? I want to say Thunderball, but I could be wrong. So I'm just going to say it was one of the Connery films.
And then, you know, just as this happened, you know, if he uses Mathis as a human shield or not, anyway, regardless of that, Bond then doesn't see him in the bin. And then he says something like, Mathis wouldn't mind or wouldn't care or something like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition, this, because I think Bond is genuinely sad that Mathis is dead, but very quickly realises he's just got to get on with it, and, like I said, just coldly puts him in the bin and it's back to business sort of thing. So it's a nice little scene, but also shows a little bit of emotion from Bond, but then also that cold, nasty streak that he needs. So I quite like that.
I wonder, as Mathis is lying in the boot of the car, slowly dying, he was thinking, oh, I should have stayed in Italy to put suntan lotion on that beautiful lady.
He could have been drinking cheap wine, rubbing suntan lotion on Gemma. I've called her Gemma. Her name might not be Gemma, I just remember her as Gemma. So, but that's what I'm calling her. But yeah, things could have been very, very different for Mathis. Rest in peace. Shortly after, you know, Bond and Camille, they need to escape, so he pays for a plane, and not long after, they're attacked and shot down by a fighter plane. I think if this is me remembering it correctly, whilst they're in the plane kind of trying to get it off the ground, he mentions something, or Camille mentions something, that the guy's going to sell him out anyway. And as the plane's taking off, you see the scene from inside the hangar, and the guy's already on the phone. The implication being they've not even taken off, and he's already sold them out. So that was quite a nice touch. They do manage to escape. They jump out, and Camille's got a parachute on. They kind of get together, and they manage to pull the cord just before they land in the kind of the sinkhole, the cavern. I thought it was a nice little scene with the planes. A very, very rough landing though, because, you know, it was just in the nick of time. So they came down with a bit of a thud, to be honest. And then in the cave, they're having a bit of a chat, and Camille goes into a bit more detail about why she wants to kill the general. So we get to find out a little bit more about her backstory, and they talk a bit about wanting to kill him and about revenge. Yeah,
we kind of get the origin backstory there. So this is obviously then just as, you know, Camille's kind of spilled the beans, and Bond has also opened up a bit about revenge as well. We see Bond discovers Green's master plan, and that is to control the supply of water in Bolivia, and they discover a dam in the cave system. So we jump to the hotel now, and Bond goes back to his hotel and finds M in his room. And this is where we get the scene that me and Andy both remembered, and this is the throwback to Goldfinger, where Jill Masterson was covered in gold, but unfortunately Fields is now covered in oil. And I thought this was good, because this was a bit of a red herring, because I thought the oil thing, because the Americans think Dominic Green is looking for oil or diamonds, don't they, in the desert, but obviously he's doing stuff with water. So I think the oil was that kind of a decoy, and because, you know, I have oil supply somewhere, but obviously we know it's actually water, or I don't know. That was my take from that scene.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's a scene earlier on where they're talking about, I think it's with Beam and Felix, where they basically say that we'll help you overthrow the government, but then whatever you find, we get a share of. Thinking, whatever, I took it to mean oil. Whatever oil you find, we, the Americans, we want a piece of that. So Green's like, yeah, sure, that's fine. But then obviously this is when we find out it's nothing to do with oil. There isn't any, and it is a red herring. So it's a nice layered part to the story, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And we get Bond phones Felix and they meet up in some kind of bar. I don't want to say a dirty bar, but it is a bar. And I know we're going to jump a few episodes forward, but this scene kind of reminded me of No Time to Die, where Bond meets Felix in a bar as well. That's right, isn't he? Near the beginning. You know how it's not dingy, but it kind of like that kind of South American setting. And I'm not saying it's all dingy, but it looked quite rough and sweaty.
A kind of a dingy Latino bar. There's a very Latin vibe to it.
Yes. So the Americans then try to capture Bond, but Felix has given Bond a tip off, and I can't remember what he says. Like, you've got so many seconds, I can't remember what it is. And then we get another chase, and my note here was a lot of chases in this film, which obviously backs up what the wife has said earlier.
Yeah, I think he says something like, he's got 30 seconds, then they have a bit of a chat, and then does he end it with, James, move your ass? Something like that, doesn't it? And then all hell breaks loose. But from there, we're off to the Bolivian desert and the hotel that's in the desert. Green and General Medrano are meeting up, discussing their agreement. Green's got some paperwork, and it turns out he wants to charge the General twice as much for the water that they're currently paying. And General's not happy with this, but Green threatens him and says, basically, if you don't agree with this, then there'll be plenty of others who will, sort of thing. It's very much, he's got him right where he wants him. You know, Green is holding all the cards here. So he now controls 90% of the water supply in Bolivia. Medrano, he's not happy. He storms back to his room, and there's a bit earlier on where a waitress kind of comes to give him a drink, and he says, I'll leave it in my room, sort of thing. So when he gets back to his room, the waitress and his drink is there. This was quite a disturbing scene, I thought. She's wrong place, wrong time. And there was the talk earlier that Camille and Bond had in the cave where what General did to her family, and now he is clearly trying to rape her. I think he ties her hands behind her back, doesn't he? He's being very forceful. I thought it was quite a disturbing scene. Now, it didn't go graphic. It didn't, there was a bit of an interruption later on because I think Camille comes in before it could go further. But I don't remember a scene in any of the Bond films so far that goes that far in terms of distress. There's torture scenes, there's violent scenes. This, to me, I don't know, it just felt a little bit out of place from what we're used to seeing. I'm not sure how necessary it really was. I think it could have been done more implicitly rather than explicitly, I would say.
I think, yeah, well put there, Andy. The only thing I think I can think of that is distressing was Onatop when she killed the I think it was the helicopter pilot. Do you remember? Because that was the first kind of sex scene on camera, where she crushes him.
Yeah, and I'm probably being double standards by saying I somewhat disagree. I understand what you mean. Obviously, it's the other way. I'm not saying woman on man violence is better than man on woman violence, but I think in that particular scenario, up until the point of his death, I think he was up for it. Yeah. This was just blatant sexual abuse, and I don't know, just it felt uncomfortable.
No, I agree, Andy, and I think the only time it's obviously in the earlier Bonds, Connery liked to slap around the odd Bond girl, which I know this is exactly anywhere near the same, but you're right. It could have been more implied opposed to what we saw.
Yeah, but like I said, Camille comes along and saves the day eventually, so it doesn't get to the point where it could have got to. But but around this sort of time, sort of in parallel, Bond and Camille are getting ready to get into the complex. So they're in the desert. They're discussing the kill, basically. And I wrote this down as a quote. Bond says, "You only need one shot, make it count." And I thought, is he being Eminem? He's been watching 8 Mile in the lead up to this to kind of psych himself up for it? Yeah, you only need one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a life.
I think that was a fantastic note. Well, I wonder what year 8 Mile came out compared to this film.
I want to say 2002. I'm going to say 2002, and then I'm going to consult my Google machine. Other search engines are available, of course, if you're a fan of Bing or Yahoo. Don't know if Jeeves is still working. I used to be able to ask him back in the day, didn't you?
Yeah.
I can't spell 8 Mile. Number 8, that'll do it, won't it? 2002, yes. Point to me.
Good memory. So maybe they copied Eminem, because this obviously came out 6 years, was it 2008? 6 years later. So moving on. So this is a cool sequence here where Green is, so this one I really liked. It's nowhere near my favourite. It's pretty much 1 or 2 shots, and it's where Green is running away from Bond, and Green gets Elvis to stand still to obviously stop Bond coming, and then there's an explosion, but the camera is kind of like, the screen's kind of split into 2, and you see like the Bond bit and then Green, and he kind of gets flung with the explosion. I thought that was really cool, that bit. And then there's 2 fights happening at the same time. We've got Bond versus Green, and then Camille versus the General as well. So I thought that was pretty good how they did that.
Yeah, it was really well done. The explosion part, like I said, was really cool. As I was watching this, I thought that's some huge explosions. And then when I saw the note about how much budget was, I'm thinking, well, that explains that then, doesn't it? My note about the fight scenes, I thought generally they were very well done, but I thought Green was too much of a match for Bond. I thought, considering their characters, I would have thought Bond would dispatch him pretty easily, because Green didn't seem to be the macho violent type.
I totally agree. Not once up until that point there was any kind of intimidation from a physical point of view from Green. But yeah, he didn't hold his own, but he put more of a resistance than Slate did, and Slate's a hired hitman. Green, up until that point, was more the brains of the operation and leading everything, and then he had people like Elvis to do his work. So yeah, it didn't sit right with me, that end bit.
Yeah, I agree. Hold that thought about Elvis for when we get to the rankings. You'll know why.
So everything kicks off. It all goes to kaput. Bond saves the girl. Green is left alive because Green basically says to Bond, from memory, Green tells Bond everything, and Bond then says, I won't kill you. So Bond leaves Green in the middle of the desert and gives him a can of motor oil, which is a kind of a reference. Well, it is a reference to what Green did to Strawberry Fields. It
is, yeah. That was a moment of, dare I say, compassion that he left him alive. But the way he left him alive, there was no compassion at all. It was nicely done, I thought. But then from there, we're off to Russia. So Bond's gone to Russia to find Vesper's boyfriend, Yusuf. Turns out that Yusuf has been working with Quantum. His role is basically to seduce women who have valuable connections, hence Vesper. And in this case, he's got another young lady with him, a Canadian intelligence operative. Bond points out the necklace that the Canadian is wearing is very similar, in fact, even the same as the one that Vesper got. And he shows her Vesper's, and that obviously makes the penny drop at that point. Now, the Canadian operative in this instance is played by Stana Katic, played by Stana Katic, whichever of those correct. We'll edit. I'm not good with pronunciations, but she's probably better known for being one of the main roles in the TV show Castle, a particular favourite of my wife's.
I haven't seen Castle, but I know who she is. So Yusuf tells Bond to kill him, and we see Bond walking out, which you kind of think, oh, Bond probably killed him. And M and some MI6 are waiting outside for him. So M tells Bond that Green has been found dead in the desert with 2 bullets in the skull and a motor oil in his stomach. And Bond gives a sly smile, doesn't he, at that bit? So I would assume what happened there is he got thirsty, junked the motor oil, and then I'm assuming Quantum people killed him because they found out that he basically told Bond everything that he needed to know, is how I interpreted that, Andy.
Yeah, I'd say that makes sense.
So it turns out Bond actually hasn't killed Yusuf. So at the beginning of the film, it was very much about vengeance, and he took that piece of information from the Destiny just before M was going to interrogate Mr. White, and he's grown within the space of whatever Andy said, 1 hour 46 minutes. He's grown during this film, so he hasn't actually killed Yusuf, and then he drops Vesper's necklace on the ground.
Yeah, and I think that brings it full circle, doesn't it, and kind of puts a full stop on the end of that. So then it's the end of the film, but we end with the gun barrel sequence. It's a new gun barrel sequence for Quantum of Solace, reverting back to the more traditional one. So we talked last week about Casino Royale and how they incorporated that into the opening scene, but this is your more traditional one, just placed at the end. Noticeable that Daniel Craig walks across the screen a lot quicker than the other Bond actors. Shoots one-handed, and the blood comes down quicker too.
So Andy, they're walking across the screen. I'm just chuckling to myself here. So as part of the research, Andy, various times we will look at YouTube, and I've mentioned before, I will look at like the different gun barrel sequences, might rewatch the opening scene, music, etc., etc. So I rewatched the Daniel Craig walking across the screen thing, and he walks really fast compared to the others. And I thought I'd read the comments, and someone said, and it got lots of thumbs up, Andy, he walks and turns and shoots exactly on 007, as in 007. So he or she were getting lots, or they got lots of thumbs up in the YouTube comments, thinking, the time it was 007, that's why Daniel Craig walked really across. Then some smart Alec underneath said he actually is 0.006. So then I just kept playing it and pausing it to get the sound, the timing of the bullet, and it's more 0.06 actually when the bullet goes off. But that's obviously, I've got loads of free time money that I spend on YouTube just doing this various research in the pod. But I thought, if it is why they did 007, I thought that was pretty slick. But he definitely walks across quick. He needs a wee break, and he's just like quickly walking across.
Yeah, he's got no time. He's a busy man. We can't be messing around with these gun barrel sequences.
And from what I read, I think they did it in 2 takes. From what I read. So feel free, listeners, if any super fans out there that debate that, or not even a super fan, a casual fan, or whatever's less than a casual fan. Anyway, it should be noted as well that the gun barrel sequence was moved to the end of the film after the director cut the final cliffhanger scene. So in the original ending, Bond goes to Guy Haynes' estate and Mr. White is present, and then Bond kills Mr. White and interrogates Haynes. So they cut that scene out, put the gun barrel sequence at the end, and as far as I'm aware, that scene is not out there in the public domain. Originally it was going to be included as a special, as a bonus in the DVD Blu-ray, but it never was. So I haven't seen it out there. I've done some research. But if there's any listeners out there that has access to it, feel free to send it to us on our social media accounts. And that's it, Andy, from the film.
I think just to your final point around the scene being cut, that would give it a very different feel to end, doesn't it? Because the way it ends kind of gives it something of a finality, whereas the scene that you've described would suggest the next film will be a further continuation. So that's 2 very different ways of ending the film.
Yeah, and obviously we're watching these films week by week, and I can't really remember much from the next 2 films. So I don't know whether they ever close off the loop in terms of Guy Haynes. Because at the moment, the Prime Minister's advisor is still alive and out there. So unless they kind of include that in a future film, which, like I said, I can't remember, or it's a passing comment to say, we're tied up the loose ends from the opera operation. At the moment, as of this film ending, Mr. White and Guy Haynes and the other people in Quantum are still out there.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And I can't remember off the top of my head as well. Maybe one for a research in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and listeners, tune in to next week when, if it is covered in next week's episode, we find out. If it's not, then listen to the other episode in the fortnight's time and we can find out.
If it's not covered at all, we forgot all about this.
I've got, yes, my memory's going, Andy, so that's my excuse as I'm getting older now.
The Rating Room.
one-liners and quotes. So, Andy, I'm going to kick this section off. So, as usual, I'm not going to try to add to anything. So, I've got the bit, Andy, actually, that you mentioned. So, this is Bond and Fields. So, this is at a shabby motel. And Bond says, "What are we doing?" And Strawberry Fields goes, "We're teachers on sabbatical. This fits our cover." And Bond goes, "No, it doesn't. I'd rather stay at a morgue. Come on." And then they get in a taxi. And they're at a 4-star hotel reception. And then Bond goes, "Hello, we are teachers on sabbatical and we just won the lottery."
Hold on 1 second, because he doesn't actually say it in English, does he? He says it, I'm assuming, in Spanish. So, what he would have actually said... Here we go. This is where I do my my audition for a foreign-speaking part. Get ready for this. And apologies for any Bolivian listeners. I'm butchering your version of Spanish. If indeed it is Spanish, because if it's not Spanish, I have to cut this whole thing out, aren't I? But I believe what he says is, "Hola, somos profesores en año sabático acabamos de ganar no, we'll just leave that bit out. Try that again. Hola, somos profesores en año sabático acabamos de ganar la lotería," is, I believe, what he says.
That is very good, Andy. I would just check in to see what language it is that they speak. And 70% of Bolivians speak Spanish. So, well done.
What about the other 30? Is that going to be Portuguese or something?
I don't know, because I just closed Google down. So let's assume that unless Andy, you want to basically translate the other 30% into all the other languages, dialects that they might speak in Bolivia.
Well, if it is Portuguese, and that's just me guessing, it's not actually too dissimilar. Portuguese would be, "Hola, somos profesores en sabático e acabamos de ganar la lotería." We're offending so many international listeners right now. It's unbelievable. Thousands and thousands of hate tweets are coming our way.
So I've Googled it, and there's a whole list of, must be about 30, 40, it says, of official languages in Bolivia.
So Spanish is top. What's the second one?
Well, it doesn't even say Spanish. There's loads of different names, which I'm guessing is in Bolivian, and there's only one that I can actually read where in brackets it says Spanish. All the others, I haven't got a clue. German is spoken by 160,000. Apparently 0.2% is Portuguese because of the sharing the border with Brazil.
Okay, so we're gonna go with Spanish then, aren't we?
I think so, Andy.
We'll go with the Spanish version, but some bonus Portuguese there for anyone from Brazil or Portugal or any other Portuguese-speaking countries. And apologies.
Yeah, we've gone off topic there. So anyway, it's on to you, Andy.
It sounded like a good idea at the time, and then I'm probably starting a war with South America. But anyway, next one is an exchange between Camille and Bond. Camille says, "So what's your interest in green?" Bond replies, "Among other things, he tried to kill a friend of mine." "A woman?" "Yes, but it's not what you think." "Your mother?" "She likes to think so."
Next one is between M, Bond, and Tanner. M goes, "Ask him about Slate." Tanner goes, "She wants to know about Slate." Bond says, "Slate was a dead end." Tanner goes, "He says he was a dead end." M, "Damn it, he killed him."
Yeah, I like that. She can read Bond like a book. She knows what his code words mean. That was nicely done. One more, an exchange between Felix and Beam. Felix says, "You know who Green is and you want to put us in bed with him?" And Beam sarcastically replies, "Yeah, you're right. We should just deal with nice people."
So moving on to our next regular segment, and this is just one point here, and this is book versus movie. And Quantum of Solace is a short story written by Ian Fleming, which I didn't know about that until typing up these notes. However, no elements apart from the name of the story was transferred to the film. So this is the third Bond film to do this, the others being The Spy Who Loved Me and A View to a Kill.
Before we move on, I think I've read this because I've read the short stories, and I'm pretty sure that Quantum of Solace was one of the ones that I've read. And I've mentioned this in a previous episode, and I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the one that isn't even about Bond. I think this is the story where Bond is telling a story. So he doesn't actually feature in the main part of it. I'm just doing a very quick Google. It's part of For Your Eyes Only, collection of short stories, and it's from A View to a Kill, For Your Eyes Only, Risiko, The Hildebrand Rarity, and Quantum of Solace. Blah blah blah. So I won't go into the whole thing because there's a bit of a blurb here, but basically, after completing a mission in the Bahamas, Bond is in Nassau and attends a disappointing dinner party. When the other guests have left, Bond remarks that if he ever marries, it would be nice to marry an air hostess. The governor then tells Bond the story of a relationship between a former civil servant and an air hostess. And then it goes on to talk about the story between the civil servant and the air hostess in quite a lot of detail. And then basically it ends that after a time she marries a rich Canadian. The governor then reveals that the dinner companions who Bond found dull were actually the people that he's just talked about in the story. And the final thing is the governor hinting that Bond should have a quantum of solace for what they went through. So it's a story that Bond hears at a dinner party, and it has, like I said, nothing to do with it. But I vaguely remember reading it, and the story being nothing to do with Bond, and that's kind of where that came from. So there you go.
Thank you. That's some live reporting in the field there for our listeners.
Yeah, and I knew it was in there somewhere. I just needed to fill in the details. It's been probably 15, 20 years since I've read the short stories. It's a long, long time ago. But let's move away from stories and let's talk about something a bit more humorous. Do you want to hear one of my world-famous James Bond jokes?
I always want to hear one of your famous James Bond jokes. And listeners out there, these are available on TikTok and YouTube.
Indeed they are, so prepare yourself for this one. So what is James Bond known as when he's out of the UK?
I don't know. What is Bond known as out of the UK?
Plus 44007.
I think that's funny, Andy, because we are obviously in the UK and we know what plus 44 is. Maybe it goes over the head of some of our listeners who we know are in America and Europe. And we do have at least one listener in Russia who I always like to think is probably Putin as he's hiding away in his bunker. So plus 44 is the UK, what would you call it?
It's the international dialing code, isn't it?
That's it, international dialing code, yeah.
Hi, Vladimir, if you're listening. Thanks for listening. Always good to have a fan. Yeah, think about some of your recent actions. Yeah, I like this joke for that reason. But I tell you what, where people may have heard the phrase plus 44 is the band, the short-lived band from the mid 2000s, around this sort of time actually. Plus 44 was two former members of Blink-182 at the time, and they gave themselves the name Plus 44 because they discussed forming this band whilst they were on tour in England. So there you go, another bit of useless trivia there as a bit of a bonus for our listeners.
What? I've got a question then. Isn't there a band called something like Some 40 something?
Some 41, you're thinking
Some
of.
41, okay.
Yeah, this is Blink-182, who used to just be called Blink. There you go, here's some more useless trivia. It used to be called Blink, but there was already a band called Blink, so for copyright reasons they had to change the name, and someone said, well, just add 182 to the end. And that's how they got the name.
See, guys and girls, you don't just learn about James Bond on this podcast.
You don't learn anything.
Well, you're going to learn something now, listeners, because this is the quiz time.
Are you ready? Let's start the quiz.
This is where I'm going to try to trip Andy up here. So, Andy, are you ready?
I am ready. Fire away.
Okay. So, just before, I just want to add a bit of pressure to you, Andy. Last week in Casino Royale, you got 50%. The week before that, you got 50%. The week before that, you got 50%. Week before that, you got 100%, but I'm going to ignore that. I just want to pile on the pressure before we get into the quiz.
Are you saying that I'm in something of a slump?
You are. You are, and I struggle with the questions this week, so that's why I try to put you a bit of under a bit of pressure, because I want to see you get 50% maximum only. Okay.
Well, I mean, this is quiz 22. I don't think I've got 0% yet, have I?
You haven't, no. You
So
haven't.
this is a good streak I'm on. I'm like the Arsenal Invincibles of 03-04, aren't I?
Yes, I guess so. But this could be could this be Pizzagate, where it all came falling apart at Old Trafford?
Yeah, I'm on the lookout for Roy Keane and Gary Neville behind me.
And Cesc Fabregas throwing a slice of pizza.
Indeed, yeah.
So Alex. Anyway, so our overseas listeners probably all go over your head on what we're talking about there. We're just talking about football/soccer. But anyway, let's get back into this. So Andy said he's ready. So the first statement: this movie is the only Bond film that has a foot chase, a car chase, a plane chase, and a boat chase. Are you ready for the next one?
Yeah, keep firing them. Let's do
Okay.
it.
Next statement: Daniel Craig and Mark Forster clashed on set several times due to the delays in filming and the accidents suffered on set by Craig, which with at least one accident involved plastic surgery. Paul McCartney turned down the opportunity to write and perform the theme song for Quantum of Solace. I'll just repeat that one. Paul McCartney turned down the opportunity to write and perform the theme song for Quantum of Solace. And the last statement: Andy Garcia was originally going to play the General in Quantum of Solace. However, Garcia was offered the role of Terry Benedict in Ocean's 12 and chose to work with Clooney, Brad Pitt and Matt Damon instead. Would you like me to repeat any of these? And before you answer, Andy, my wife was listening to the pod recently and she says, Jay, why do you talk in a funny voice when doing the questions? And I said, it's because I want to make it clear so our listeners can play along as well.
And also, whilst I'm doing my best to audition for future parts in Bond films, you've got designs on game show hosting.
Yeah, indeed. I can't think
Jay's House of Games, you know, goodbye Richard Osman, hello Jay. That could work. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? If you want to get rid of Clarkson.
Yes, yeah, I didn't even know he presented that.
Yeah, he does, yeah. There you go. Well, as of this recording, he does anyway. Recent comments that have come to light may or may not hinder that piece of employment. But yeah, no, I don't need you to repeat any. I've got them written down. Once again, you've set me a very high bar that I've got to cross. Now, the first statement straight out of the bat, that's got to be true, hasn't it? All those chase scenes. And we mentioned earlier, we can't remember a film that had all those chase scenes in, so I've got to think that first one is true, unless that is a red herring that you're throwing me straight away. But I'm going to stick with it. I think that is true. Yeah, second statement around Craig and Forster clashing on set. I think I can understand there would have been delays, because this was around the time of the writer's strike, 2008, so I'd imagine there would have been delays. So that's feasible, but I'm going to say no. I'm going to say that one's false. Which leaves me Paul McCartney and Andy Garcia. I'm going to say the Paul McCartney statement is also false. I don't think he was offered Quantum Solace, and I don't think he would have fit the mould. So I'm going to say that one's false. But I'm going to say true about Andy Garcia. I think he would have been a good Bond villain. But obviously the Ocean's 12 sequel to Ocean's 11 was big business, and he was an integral part of that, so that would have been difficult to turn down. So I'm going true, false, false, true.
So Andy, you got 50% this week. So
Streak continues.
do you want to hazard a guess at what ones were right or wrong?
Are we going to say? I'm going to say, if I have to change my answer, the second one is actually true about the clashes on set, and the Garcia one is false.
So, no. So the two correct ones are the Bond chase and Paul McCartney. Apparently, he did turn it down, and he was struggling to think what would rhyme with Quantum of Solace. So he passed it up. Interestingly, Daniel Craig and Mark Forster was actually recommended for the director gig by Daniel Craig.
Okay.
And Andy Garcia one was me just thinking of random actors in that had the Latino look around that time. So Ocean's 12 came out the year before Quantum of Solace. So I did a bit of research just for that false statement there. But yeah. So not bad, Andy.
The slump continues.
Yeah, you're halfway, so it's like you said.
I'm not at rock bottom.
No.
I'm a glass half empty, glass half full kind of guy, whichever way you want to look at it.
The rating room.
Moving on, let's move on to our... I don't know if you say that it's the second part of the show, really. It's the rankings and ratings that me and Andy do. So
it's the show within the show, isn't it? That's what it is.
Yeah. So you get 2 shows for the price of 1. The run times. Obviously, Andy mentioned at the top of the pod, it was 1 hour 46 minutes, and I think Andy alluded to, I can't remember, but it is the shortest runtime out of all the 22 Bond films so far. So that's 4 minutes shorter than Goldfinger and 5 minutes shorter than Dr. No. Obviously, listeners, feel free to jump on the website and you can see the full list on there. So me and Andy would have to go through every single film here. You don't want to just hear us talking out each of the film names. But interestingly, Daniel Craig, over the 2 films, he's got a runtime of 4 hours 10 minutes. But because this one is a lot shorter than Casino Royale, which was 2 hours and 24 minutes, which we obviously reviewed last week, and it went in at number 1, his average drops down significantly, down to 2 hours 5 minutes. So across the 6 Bonds now, he's actually the second shortest in terms of average runtime. That's probably going to change over the next few weeks because this is a short film compared to the others. Moving on to the kill count. Again, we mentioned at the top of the podcast that Bond had 16 confirmed kills. Where does that leave us? So he actually moves into the top 10 this week with Quantum of Solace. So he's smack in the middle of For Your Eyes Only, which is 18 kills, and Octopussy, which is 15 kills. So Daniel Craig is sandwiched between 2 Roger Moore films. So I don't think that's a bad place to be. So looking at the kills across the whole franchise in terms of actors, Daniel Craig is actually in 4th place now with 27 kills across the 2 films, which is 13.5 average. So that's just above Timothy Dalton, but quite a bit behind in terms of Sean Connery kills. But obviously Sean Connery's got 4 more films on Daniel Craig. Moving on to the next one before I pass over to Andy is Martini Watch. And Andy mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, Bond does drink martini in the Quantum of Solace. And I'm slightly pausing here, Andy, because I've got a question. Is this the first time that you hear the ingredients of the martini, or did we hear it in Casino Royale?
I think we hear them in Casino Royale, and that's when he names it the Vesper. And then in this time he's on the plane, isn't he? And the bartender in the plane reads them out to him. Because hasn't Bond had so many that he can't remember what he's drinking? Isn't that the...
Yeah, and Mathis, isn't it, comes over and he says, like, whatever it is, I don't know, I can't remember how many shots of parts of Gordon's and stuff like that. But yeah, I just thought, I can't remember, yeah. I'm sure I remember in Casino Royale he describes it what it is, but before that I don't think it's ever explicitly mentioned in any of the Connery, Moores, Daltons or Lazenby film, is it?
No, I don't think it is.
Okay, so over to you, Andy.
Okay, so the next thing is the James Bond introduction, and as mentioned earlier, it doesn't appear. So this is only the 4th time in the franchise so far that we don't have the James Bond introduction. And obviously, for Craig, he's currently on 50-50 with just 1 out of 2. But 4 out of 22, that's not a bad run rate. In terms of hat wearing and hat throwing, neither are to be found in this film, and that, by looking at the notes, is 4 films in a row now. So the hats are becoming a thing of the past for sure. Next up, Felix Leiter. We do see Felix again, and once again played by Jeffrey Wright, who appears in the 2nd film in a row. We talked a little bit about Jeffrey Wright in last week's episode. Fantastic actor, and he does a great job as Felix. Will we see him next week? Let's find out next week, shall we? And one more thing from me before I pass back to you is your favourite ranking, and that's the box office. So, budget-wise, what Jay mentioned earlier, $230 million, which is by far and away the highest budget of any Bond film so far. The actual worldwide box office was $591.7 million, which is on a par with Casino Royale. And, it's less than $3 million difference, so it's very similar in terms of its taking, even though the budget was massively different. And in terms of the adjusted box office, $795.3 million puts it in 8th place so far out of 22.
So moving on to Bond girls. So we've said this for quite a few episodes now. We're not going to go through every single one because as of 22 films, we are on to 72 Bond girls. So Andy, I'm just going to filter on the Quantum of Solace ones. So we've got 2, as Andy mentioned at the top of the podcast, and I put Strawberry Fields in at 36 and Camille in at 27. How about you?
So I've gone slightly further apart with mine. Strawberry at 45. An okay Bond girl, but a little bit too easy to jump into bed with him, and maybe not quite so strong. But I've got Camille up as high as 14, so just above Jinx, just below Octopussy. I thought a very strong, independent, kick-ass Bond girl. It'd have been nice to see a little bit more of her, to be honest, but 14, respectable position. Next up, the theme song. So this is the Jack White Alicia Keys duet of Another Way to Die. Something of a disappointing song. I understand what they were going for. Obviously, they changed tack slightly last week with the Chris Cornell version, which I really liked. I've got that in at number 6. This felt much weaker to me. I've got this in at 17 out of 22, so just below All Time High by Rita Coolidge and just above the On Her Majesty's Secret Service theme by John Barry. An okay song, just I felt like it. I understand what they were going for with the new style Bond, just wasn't a banger. What about you, Jay?
So a couple of things. I was surprised where you put this one because I know your music taste. I thought you might have liked this one a bit more, being alternative, rocky. So I was a bit surprised when I saw your ranking. I put it in at 18th position, which is only one below you. I like that it was different to other Bond songs, but I just don't think it was a good Bond fit at all. And when watching the film with the wife, at the opening scene, she made a witty comment to say, this gives Madonna a run for the money in terms of worst Bond song. Obviously, Madonna, in my listing, is actually one place higher than this, and on yours, it's at the bottom. And in terms of the wife, she very much dislikes the Madonna Die Another Day song, so I thought that was quite witty.
Interesting. I guess that's what the kids would call a sick burn fan. That's what that is. Here's a question for you. Would this song have been better if he'd have sang it with his wife/sister?
No, I think Alicia Keys is one of the good bits on it. But yeah, it's just not a Bond song at all. No, it's not a Bond song at all. I just really, I didn't. And I'm surprised it's not actually lower, but I did the whole thing of listening to our Spotify playlist of the Bond films, the songs, and I do think it's better than Show or Crow and Garbage. So the 90s, the Brosnan era was disappointed in terms of my rankings, but I do think this one's actually better. And I don't know, it's because it's so different. That's why I put it a bit higher. Moving on, credits. I'm just going to keep this short and sweet. I'll put Quantum of Solace in 17th position. Obviously mentioned at the top of the pod what their different elements are with the opening credits. But yeah, for me, it was disappointing. How about you, Andy?
So last week I put Casino Royale in at 8. This week it's replaced by Quantum of Solace at 8. I think much of the same kind of stuff. I slightly preferred this, so this knocks Casino Royale down a place. But 8th, it was fine. Nothing egregious, but yeah, it's not going to trouble the top 3 or top 5, that's for sure. So solid but not spectacular is how I would view it. Let's move on again to the villains. Now, like the Bond girls, we're not going to go through all of these because we have quite the list now. By my count, we have 84 villains in total with the addition of these. So the 5 villains that we have for Quantum of Solace, and I'm going to go top to bottom. So I'm going to start with my favourite villain. That was actually General Medrano, although they're not the main villain of the piece. My favourite one, and I've put him in 34th. So, you know, middle table. Bit of a nasty streak, you know, bit vicious, bit handsy, but ultimately not a great threat. So, you know, respectable 34. Now, the rest of the villains are all going to appear in the bottom half of the table. So I've got Green in at 51. You know, other than the fight scene with Bond where he was seemingly just as tough, it didn't come across as intimidating. He was just a bit of a slime ball, really. Not a great villain at all. Mr. White, didn't really see much of Mr. White. He was there obviously at the start, and then he was at the opera and then disappeared. Like, who knows what happened to him? That seems like a gap that wasn't closed. So it was difficult to really judge him on much of what he did. So for that reason, I've got him in at 67. So he's definitely towards the bottom. Craig Mitchell, I've got just slightly below at 70. This is one of those where he's really hampered by time. He's in it really for the one scene, and then he dies at the end of it. It's a good scene. It's my favourite scene in the film, but ultimately you don't get to see what he's really done as a villain. He's outed as a double agent. He's chased and he's killed. So it's difficult to judge him beyond that. If he was a more integral to the story, he could have been an all-timer. He could have been in the sort of Alex Trevelyan territory if he was more integral to the story, but it was a bit part player to just get to the next scene. So I couldn't justify any higher than 70. Now, finally, the final one on this for me is Elvis. And I've put Elvis in right at the bottom at 84. Now, earlier I told you to hold that thought on Elvis. And I have a question for you linked to that. What did he actually do?
You know what, Andy? I do my ratings before you, and then you add your ratings on. So when I saw your rating come in after mine, I thought, bottom? And then I thought, yeah, but what did actually Elvis do? So I couldn't even justify why I put him. I put mine low. Elvis is low on my list. But he was tripped down the stairs by an admin person. So Strawberry Fields is not a field op. She basically, I don't think she's a receptionist, but she's some kind of admin, I don't know, intelligence, but she's not an operative at all. She trips him up. His 2p or something comes off. He goes to the front gate when they're at the docks to get Bond's Universal exports and make business card, and makes a phone call. And then he's like, and he dies by the explosion. He's just like lingering in the background, isn't he, with Green all the time. So I couldn't think, when I saw that, I thought, yeah, I can't argue at all at your ranking. And then I thought, shall I change my mind? And I thought, no, I can't be bothered. I'll keep mine where it is.
He's got a crap haircut.
Yeah.
He stands behind a not very good villain. He gets tripped over by an admin person, and he dies. Like, take him out of the film, nothing changes, other than she has to trip someone else up on the stairs. So, and bear in mind, one of the so-called villains is Octopus, who turns out to not be a villain at all, and he's below her. So, bang last on the list, 84 out of 84 so far. So that's my order. Jay, where did you rank the 5 from this film?
So my ones are not too dissimilar to yours, Andy. However, when you went in with the general at 34, all of my villains are a 51 or lower. So I think there's a very strong case of arguing that the general is better than Dominic Green from, based on the comments that we've made earlier. But I think Dominic Green, he is the main villain, so I put him in at 51, which incidentally is actually the same ranking that you've got him in, which I didn't realise until now. Then I would go down to 68, where I put the general. 69 is Elvis. 70 is Mr. White. And then 5 more spots down below there is 75 Craig Mitchell. So for me, Quantum of Solace has some really weak villains / henchmen. Because Mr. White, he's a bit of a token villain. He's at the beginning, he's at the opera house, and then he's had his scene cut at the end. I don't recall seeing him after the opera house. I don't think we see him after then.
I don't think we do. And I don't think he really plays into the story.
No.
Other than the very first scene.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if I put him there because of his, I don't know, I wouldn't say his legacy, but the influence that he's had in the previous film. So he's maybe too high, but because we're looking at each film independently. But Craig Mitchell, like you said, apart from the beginning chase, he's obviously then met his sticky end, and then that's it. So for me, the villains in this film were really, really weak. Maybe they were better. It might have moved it up a point in terms of my ranking. But yeah, very, very disappointing. And talk about rankings, we just move on to movies now. I've put Quantum of Solace. Obviously, I mentioned earlier on, I gave it 6 out of 10. And as we mentioned pretty much every week in the pod, we're not having any joint places in terms of the movie rankings. So I've got a number of films 6 out of 10. I've got 5 different films, including this one, which is Live and Let Die, You Only Live Twice, Octopussy, and The Living Daylights. For me, Quantum of Solace is weaker than all of those. So it's at the bottom of the pile in terms of the 6s, but above the 5s. So out of the 22 films so far, I've got Quantum of Solace in 16th position, which is a massive drop from Casino Royale last week, which I gave 8 out of 10. So very strong opening with Daniel Craig. So I mentioned earlier, about the budget and the box office stats. So for all that extra money, they've lost 2 points and all those millions that I mentioned earlier. What about you, Andy? You obviously gave it a 7 earlier. Where does that pull it in your league table?
So it's a bit higher up for me. It's the 7 out of 10 ranks it on par with GoldenEye, A View to a Kill, For Your Eyes Only, License to Kill, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Spy Who Loved Me, and From Russia with Love. So there's a lot of company there for it. It's pretty much bang in the middle. So those films I've mentioned are between 5th and 12th place. Quantum of Solace ranks at number 8 for me. I really enjoyed the film a lot more than I remembered it, and there was a lot of good action. There was a lot of good scenes. This is one of those that could have been an all-timer had it had a better story, and to your earlier point, better villains as well. It was a little bit haphazard in places. There were some things that just didn't get solved, Mr. White being one of them. The whole Camille thing just appearing at the party, and there was an element of disjointedness about it, but there was enough good to rank it high enough. But if they'd have tightened up the story, tightened up the characters, this could have been, a top 3, top 5 film for me. So I really enjoyed it, but yeah, it was a definite step down from Casino Royale, which I've ranked as my number one movie so far with 9 out of 10. So it was always going to struggle to compete with that. But a solid top half of the table, 8th place with 7 out of 10. Moving swiftly on, also we've had the 2 Craig films so far, so we can rank them by actor quite easily. For me, it comes second of 2, with Casino Royale being 9 out of 10 and Quantum being 7. Do you just want to remind the listeners of your ranking?
Yeah, so Casino Royale is 8 out of 10 and Quantum of Solace is 6 out of 10 so far for the Daniel Craig. So that's a total of 14 out of 20, and that's a 7 out of 10 average. And moving on, the last bit in terms of the rankings and ratings is Bond actors. So at the moment, we've obviously had all 6 actors now. We've still got a few more films for Daniel Craig, but for my rankings as of at the point of Quantum of Solace is Connery, Brosnan, Roger Moore, Daniel Craig, Dalton, and Lazenby. So that's 1 to 6. So Daniel Craig remains in the middle of the pack for me. What about you, Andy?
So no change for me. Craig remains my favourite Bond. He went straight in at the top spot last week, so I thought Casino Royale and his performance was excellent. I thought his performance in this was excellent as well. He was let down by some of the things around him, but my order remains the same: Craig, Connery, Brosnan, Moore, Lazenby and Dalton. But that could all change as we get into next week's pod. Now, we're about done here for today, aren't we? So I'll just briefly give you an insight into what we're going to be talking next week, because from my limited Googling ability, I've got to find this. It doesn't seem to be a Bond story at all. It seems to be the story of Chicken Licking, and which is a European folktale about a chicken who believes the world is coming to an end, and he keeps going round saying that the sky is falling down. Is that what we're talking about next week, or have I misspelled something along the way? Yeah, there's definitely something to do with Skyfall, and that's all we can really say for now. Let's find out next week what we're really going to be talking about.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating Room. The Rating Room.